They saw an old woman in a wheelchair at Miami International Airport. Elena Vasquez looked fragile, confused, speaking broken English to the TSA agents, who rolled their eyes at another elderly passenger slowing down their security line, but hidden beneath the surface of this quiet 72-year-old grandmother was a truth so classified that it would soon have the Director of Homeland Security personally calling the airport, and a story of heroism that had been buried for 30 years to protect national security. The fluorescent lights of Miami International Airport's Terminal D buzzed with their familiar electronic hum as the pre-dawn security checkpoint came to life. At 5:47 a.m., the first wave of business travelers began queuing behind the rope barriers, clutching coffee cups and boarding passes with the weary determination of people who had seen too many airports. Elena Vasquez sat in her standard airport wheelchair, positioned slightly apart from the main security line. At 72, she appeared exactly what the TSA agents expected to see, another elderly passenger requiring special assistance. Her silver hair neatly arranged despite the early hour, her weathered hands folded over a simple black purse, her dark eyes, still sharp despite the line's time, had etched around them, watched the checkpoint activity with what most would interpret as the nervous attention of an infrequent traveler. TSA Supervisor Derek Morrison, 28-year-old with 3 years of airport security experience and an inflated sense of his own authority, approached Elena's wheelchair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of elderly passengers. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his attitude carried the particular brand of impatience that came from years of dealing with people who didn't understand proper security procedures. "Morning, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice carrying just enough courtesy to satisfy policy while making it clear he considered this a routine inconvenience. "I'm going to need to see your ID and boarding pass." Elena reached into her purse with hands that showed a slight tremor. Whether from age or something else wasn't immediately clear. She produced a Florida driver's license and a printed boarding pass for American Airlines Flight 1847 to Washington, D.C., departing at 7:15 a.m. Morrison examined both documents with exaggerated thoroughness, his frown deepening as he studied the license. "This address is in Coral Gables," he said, as if this was somehow suspicious. "What's the purpose of your travel today?" "I have appointment," Elena replied, her English carrying the accent of someone who had learned the language later in life. "In Washington." "What kind of appointment?" Morrison pressed, his tone suggesting that elderly passengers had no legitimate business in the nation's capital. Elena hesitated, her fingers unconsciously adjusting the small silver cross that hung around her neck. It's personal matter. The vagueness of her response seemed to trigger Morrison's suspicion protocols. He glanced at his colleague, TSA agent Sandra Williams, a heavy-set woman with 15 years of experience who had learned to read people by their behavior rather than their appearance. "Personal matter," Morrison repeated, his voice rising just enough to attract attention from nearby passengers. "Can you be more specific about the nature of your visit?" Elena's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that Williams noticed but Morrison missed entirely. "I prefer not to discuss," Elena said, her voice quiet but carrying an undertone of dignity that suggested she was accustomed to keeping certain information private. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elena Vasquez wasn't just a retired grandmother from Coral Gables. She wasn't even really Elena Vasquez, though she had been living under that name for 30 years. The woman sitting in that wheelchair had once been Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Rodriguez, one of the most successful intelligence operatives in CIA history, whose infiltration missions in Central America during the 1980s had prevented 3 separate international incidents and saved countless American lives. But Isabella Rodriguez had officially died in a car bombing in San Salvador in 1994. Her funeral had been held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, attended by CIA directors, Pentagon officials, and a grieving family who believed they were burying their daughter, sister, and mother. The grave marker was real. The body beneath it was not. The car bombing had been Isabella's extraction, a carefully orchestrated event designed to get her out of Central America before enemy intelligence services could identify and eliminate someone whose knowledge could compromise decades of American operations. The explosion had been real enough to fool everyone, including foreign agents who had been closing in on her position. Elena Vasquez had been born in a safe house in Virginia, complete with 30 years of carefully constructed background documentation. She'd been given a modest pension, a small house in Coral Gables, and strict instructions to maintain the lowest possible profile while living out her retirement in anonymity. For 3 decades, she had been the perfect, invisible retiree. She attended Mass at St. Augustine Catholic Church every Sunday, played dominoes with her neighbors, and told anyone who asked that she had worked as a secretary for an import-export company a cover story that explained her occasional knowledge of foreign affairs while keeping her true background buried. But invisibility was about to become impossible. Morrison had decided that. Elena's reluctance to discuss her travel plans warranted additional scrutiny. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to conduct a more thorough screening," he announced, loud enough to draw attention from other passengers. "Please follow Agent Williams to the special screening area." "Is necessary?" Elena asked, though she was already prepared to comply. 30 years of careful living had taught her when to pick battles and when to submit to authority. "Security protocol," Morrison replied with satisfaction, as if he'd uncovered something significant. "When passengers can't provide clear answers about their travel purposes, we have to investigate further." Williams wheeled Elena toward a partitioned area designed for additional screening, noting the way the elderly woman's hands remained perfectly steady despite the obvious stress of being singled out. Most passengers subjected to special screening showed clear signs of nervousness, sweating, fidgeting, rapid speech. Elena displayed none of these tells. "Don't mind Morrison," Williams said quietly as they moved away from the main checkpoint. "He's young and thinks every passenger is hiding something." Elena gave her a small smile that contained more warmth than gratitude. "Some of us have lived long enough to know that patience is often the best response to authority," she replied, her English suddenly more precise than it had been moments before. The special screening area was a glass-enclosed space that provided privacy while allowing security personnel to maintain visual oversight. Morrison followed them, carrying Elena's purse and a small carry-on bag she had been traveling with. "I'm going to need to search your belongings more thoroughly," Morrison announced, snapping on latex gloves with unnecessary drama. "Since you're being evasive about your travel plans, we need to ensure you're not carrying anything that could pose a security risk." Elena watched him open her purse with the calm attention of someone who had endured far more invasive searches in much more dangerous circumstances. Her possessions were laid out on the metal examination table: a worn leather wallet, prescription medications in clearly labeled bottles, reading glasses in a hard case, tissues, breath mints, and a small book of Catholic prayers written in Spanish. "What's this?" Morrison asked, holding up a small velvet pouch that had been tucked into an inner compartment of the purse. "Religious medals," Elena replied simply, "from my family." Morrison opened the pouch and spilled its contents onto the table. Several small silver medals scattered across the metal surface saying Christopher, the Virgin Mary, St. Jude, but mixed among them was something that made Williams lean forward for a closer look. "This doesn't look religious," Morrison said, holding up a small pin that was clearly military in design. Though its specific meaning wasn't immediately obvious, Elena's eyes followed the pin as Morrison examined it. "Is memento," she said, her voice careful. "From a long time ago." "Memento of what?" Morrison pressed, turning the pin over in his hands. "This looks like some kind of military insignia." "My husband served," Elena replied, the lie coming easily after 30 years of practice. "He died many years ago." But Williams was studying the pin more carefully. She'd been married to a Marine for 20 years before his death. She'd seen enough military decorations to recognize that this wasn't standard issue. The design was too specific, too unusual. "For a common service medal, Derek," she said quietly, "I think you should take a look at this more carefully." Morrison was already moving on to Elena's carry-on bag, determined to find something that would justify his suspicion. Inside were changes of clothes, toiletries, more medications, and a manila envelope sealed with tape. "What's in the envelope?" Morrison demanded. "Documents," Elena replied. "For appointment?" "What kind of documents?" Elena hesitated, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the silver cross around her neck again. Legal papers, for a state matter. Morrison began to tear open the envelope before Williams could stop him. "Sir," she said, "maybe we should." But Morrison had already pulled out the contents. Several official-looking documents fell onto the table, and even his untrained eye could see that these weren't typical estate papers. The letterhead read Central Intelligence Agency, and the documents bore classification markings that he didn't recognize. Elena's entire demeanor shifted in that moment. The tremor in her hands disappeared, her posture straightened, and her eyes took on the alert focus of someone whose cover had just been blown. "Those are confidential," she said, her English now crisp and authoritative. "You don't have clearance to view them." Morrison laughed, but the sound was nervous rather than dismissive. "Clearance, lady. This is airport security. I have clearance to search whatever I want." But Williams was reading the documents over his shoulder, her expression growing more serious with each line. "Derek," she said urgently, "I think we need to call a supervisor." One of the documents was clearly a summons to appear before a congressional committee investigating intelligence operations in Central America during the 1980s. Another was a letter from the CIA's Office of General Counsel, discussing the declassification of certain operational files related to subject, Operation Mockingbird, Isabella Rodriguez. Lena watched them process the information, calculating how much damage had been done and what her options were now. 30 years of careful anonymity were unraveling in a Miami airport's security checkpoint, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Who are you?" Williams asked quietly, her voice carrying respect rather than suspicion. Before Elena could answer, Morrison's radio crackled to life. "Supervisor Morrison, please respond. You have a priority call from Homeland Security regarding a passenger in your section." The blood drained from Morrison's face as he realized that whatever he had stumbled into was far bigger than a routine security screening. Keyed his radio with shaking hands. "This is Morrison. I'm currently conducting additional screening on a passenger." "It's the passenger, Elena Vasquez," the voice on the radio asked. Morrison looked at Elena's driver's license, then back at the CIA documents spread across the table. "Yes, sir. Discontinue your screening immediately and escort Ms. Vasquez to conference room. See, a federal representative is en route to the airport." The radio went silent, leaving Morrison and Williams staring at Elena, who was calmly gathering the scattered documents and returning them to their envelope. "I tried to avoid this," Elena said quietly. "I have lived peacefully for 30 years. Some debts to history cannot be avoided forever." 20 minutes later, Elena sat in conference room C, still in her wheelchair, but no longer appearing frail or confused. Her back was straight, her eyes alert, and her hands steady as she arranged the CIA documents in front of her. The door opened to admit a man in a dark suit who moved with the controlled efficiency of someone accustomed to handling classified situations. He was followed by Airport Director Sarah Chen, who looked like she'd been awakened by an emergency phone call. Edgy saw an emergency phone call, which, in fact, she had. "Ms. Rodriguez," the federal agent said, using her real name for the first time in 30 years. "I'm Agent Robert Hayes, CIA Operations. I apologize for the irregularities in your screening process." Elena nodded acknowledgement. "Agent Hayes. I assume my congressional testimony has been rescheduled?" "Yes, ma'am. Due to the security breach here, we're implementing enhanced protection protocols for your transport to Washington." Airport Director Chen looked confused. "I'm sorry, but can someone explain what's happening? My TSA agent seemed to have triggered some kind of federal incident." Agent Hayes looked to Elena, who gave a slight nod of permission. "Ms. Vasquez is actually retired Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Rodriguez. Former CIA operations," Hayes explained carefully. "She's been living under protected identity for 30 years. She's scheduled to provide classified testimony to Congress about intelligence operations that were previously too sensitive to acknowledge. The Senate Intelligence Committee is finally investigating Operation Mockingbird," Elena added. "After 3 decades, they want to hear about what really happened in Central America during the 1980s. Chen's eyes widened as the implications became clear. So when our agents were searching her belongings, they were inadvertently exposing classified materials and potentially compromising a protected witness, Hayes confirmed. Through the conference room's glass windows, Elena could see the security checkpoint continuing its normal operations. Morrison and Williams were visible at their stations, both looking shaken by their encounter with a passenger whose background was far more complex than they had imagined. "What happens now?" Chen asked. "Ms. Rodriguez will complete her journey to Washington under federal protection," Hayes replied. "And your security team will receive additional training about handling passengers with classified backgrounds." Elena spoke up for the first time. "Since the explanations began, Agent Hayes, I would like to speak with the officers who conducted my screening." Hayes looked surprised. "Ma'am, that's not necessary. They were simply doing their jobs." "Exactly," Elena replied. "And I believe there's a teaching moment here." 15 minutes later, Morrison and Williams were escorted into the conference room, both looking nervous and confused. Morrison's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, while Williams maintained her professional composure despite the obvious stress of the situation. Elena studied them both before speaking. "Officer Morrison, Officer Williams, please sit." They took seats across from her, Morrison fidgeting with his radio while Williams kept her attention focused on Elena's face. "You were doing your job," Elena began. "Security requires vigilance, suspicion, thorough investigation. I don't fault you for that." Morrison started to speak, but Elena held up a hand. "However," she continued, "there's a difference between thorough security and humiliation, between vigilance and prejudice, between suspicion and assumptions." She looked directly at Morrison. "You assumed that because I am elderly, because I speak with an accent, because I was reluctant to discuss personal matters, that I was either confused or hiding something improper." Morrison's face reddened, but he didn't deny the accusation. "Officer Williams," Elena continued, "you showed more restraint, more respect. You recognize that people have legitimate reasons for privacy that don't involve security threats." Williams nodded slightly. "Ma'am, I've learned that assumptions about passengers based on age or appearance are usually wrong." Exactly, Elena said. "In my previous career, I learned that the most dangerous people often appear the most harmless. But I also learned that most harmless people are exactly what they appear to be: human beings, deserving of dignity." She opened her purse and removed the military pin that had started Morrison's suspicions. "This pin represents service in a classified unit that saved American lives. For 30 years, I couldn't acknowledge what it meant. Today, I can finally tell that story to Congress." Elena looked around the room at the assembled officials. "Every day, thousands of people pass through this checkpoint. Most have stories you'll never know. Some are running from danger, some are running toward hope. A few are carrying secrets. That shaped history." She focused on Morrison again. "Your job is to keep everyone safe. But safety includes the safety to travel with dignity, regardless of age, accent, or reluctance to share personal information." Agent Hayes cleared his throat. "Ms. Rodriguez, we need to discuss your travel arrangements." Elena nodded and began to stand from her wheelchair. The movement was smooth and controlled, revealing that her apparent frailty had been partly performance, a protective habit developed over 30 years of avoiding attention. "I won't need the wheelchair for the rest of my journey," she said simply. Morrison's eyes widened as he realized how much he had misjudged the woman in front of him. 2 hours later, Elena sat in the first-class cabin of American Airlines Flight 1847, her original boarding pass still valid despite the dramatic interruption to her travel plans. Agent Hayes sat across the aisle, maintaining discreet protection while allowing her to travel with relative normalcy. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Elena looked out the window at the Miami coastline shrinking below. 30 years of quiet retirement were ending, but perhaps it was time. The secrets she had kept were finally ready to be told. The Congress that had once sent her into danger was now ready to hear about the sacrifices made in America's name. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a message from Officer Williams. "Thank you for the lesson in dignity. I won't forget it." Elena smiled and typed back. "Dignity is the one thing no one can take from you without your permission." 3 hours later, Elena's flight landed at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. As she walked through the jetway, no longer needing assistance, no longer hiding behind the persona of a confused elderly passenger. She thought about the testimony she would give the next day. For 30 years, she had carried secrets about American intelligence operations that had saved lives and prevented international incidents. She had sacrificed her identity, her family relationships, and her public recognition to protect those secrets. Now finally, history was ready to acknowledge what had been hidden for so long. But first, she had a stop to make. Elena's taxi drove through the familiar streets of Washington, D.C., past the monuments and government buildings, where she had once reported 4 briefings and received assignments that would take her into some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The city had changed in 30 years, but the weight of secrets and the burden of service remained constant. The taxi stopped at Arlington National Cemetery. Elena walked slowly through the perfectly aligned rows of white headstones, carrying a small bouquet of flowers she had purchased at the airport. She knew exactly where she was going. Section 60. Site 8472. The grave marker that bore her original name, Isabella Rodriguez. Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army, beloved daughter and sister. For 30 years, her family had grieved at this grave, believing she had died in a car bombing in El Salvador. They had aged without her, celebrated holidays without her, faced their own challenges without her support or comfort. Of her identity had cost more than just her recognition. It had cost her the relationships that mattered most. Elena knelt beside the headstone and placed the flowers at its base. Tomorrow, she said quietly, they'll finally know the truth about what you did, what you sacrificed, what you accomplished. She reached into her purse and removed the military pin that had caused so much trouble at the airport. But it was a unit citation from her intelligence operations in Central America, recognizing missions that had prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted drug trafficking operations, and gathered intelligence that had shaped American foreign policy for decades. But tonight, she continued, I'm just glad to finally visit my own grave. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 30 years hiding from a name that was carved in stone just yards away. Isabella Rodriguez had been buried here in 1994, but Elena Vasquez had lived on, carrying the memories and the knowledge and the burden of service that could never be fully explained or acknowledged. As the sun set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Elena made peace with both of her identities. Tomorrow, she would testify before Congress about Operation Mockingbird, about intelligence missions that had remained classified for 3 decades, about decisions made in the shadows that had shaped the light. But tonight, she was simply a woman, honoring her own sacrifice, acknowledging the price of service, and preparing to step back into history. The next morning, Elena sat before the Senate Intelligence Committee in a secured hearing room in the Capitol building. The senators who faced her represented both parties, both generations, and both perspectives on America's intelligence operations. During the Cold War, Committee Chairman Senator Robert Walsh called the hearing to order. This committee is meeting today to receive testimony from retired Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Rodriguez regarding classified intelligence operations conducted in Central America between 1982 and 1994. Elena sat straight in her chair, wearing a simple blue suit that conveyed dignity without ostentation. Her silver hair was arranged professionally. Her hands rested calmly on the table in front of her, the same hands that had trembled at the airport security checkpoint just 24 hours earlier. Ms. Rodriguez, Senator Walsh continued, before we begin, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary sacrifice you've made for this country. Living under an assumed identity for 30 years, separated from your family, unable to receive public recognition for your service, these are sacrifices that most Americans cannot imagine. Elena nodded acknowledgement. Thank you, Senator. But I want to be clear that my testimony today is not about seeking recognition. It's about ensuring that history accurately records what happened during a crucial period in American foreign policy. Senator Walsh referred to his notes. Your operations in Central America were part of what was designated Operation Mockingbird. Can you explain to this committee what that operation entailed? Operation Mockingbird was a comprehensive intelligence gathering and disruption program designed to counter Soviet and Cuban influence in Central America Elena began. And my role was to infiltrate organizations that were receiving foreign support and to gather intelligence about planned attacks against American interests. Over the next 4 hours, Elena provided testimony that illuminated one of the most shadowy periods of American intelligence history. She described missions that had prevented terrorist attacks, operations that had disrupted Soviet weapons shipments, and intelligence gathering that had saved American lives. But she also testified about the human cost of such operations, the agents who had died, the local populations caught in the crossfire, the moral ambiguities of conducting secret operations in foreign countries. Senator Martinez, you asked about accountability, Elena said during one exchange. Every operation I participated in was authorized at the highest levels of government. We didn't act independently. We followed orders from officials who understood. The stakes had made difficult decisions about American security. Senator Martinez leaned forward. But Ms. Rodriguez, don't you think the American people had a right to know about these operations? Elena paused before answering. Senator, 30 years ago, public knowledge of these operations would have compromised ongoing missions and endangered lives. American agents, local allies, innocent civilians, all would have been at risk if operational details had been disclosed. And now, Senator Martinez pressed, now, most of the immediate security concerns have been resolved. The Cold War is over. The agents involved are retired or deceased. Intelligence networks have been disbanded. History can finally be told without compromising current operations. During a break in the testimony, Elena walked to a window overlooking the National Mall. The same monuments that had inspired her to serve her country 30 years ago still stood, still representing the ideals that had motivated her to accept missions that required her to disappear from the world. Agent Hayes approached her. How are you feeling about the testimony? Elena considered the question. Relieved, she said finally. For 30 years I've carried these secrets alone. Now, they belong to history, where they should be. Any regrets about coming forward? Elena looked out at the Capitol dome, thinking about the family she had been separated from, the recognition she had been denied, the normal life she had sacrificed for service. I regret the cost, she said, but not the service. Someone had to do this work. Someone had to gather the intelligence, prevent the attacks, disrupt the threats. If not me, then someone else would have had to make the same sacrifices. The hearing resumed. Senator Walsh asked the question that had been underlying all the testimony. Ms. Rodriguez, in your assessment, were these operations worth the cost? Elena had been expecting this question, and her answer came without hesitation. Senator, in 1985, intelligence I gathered prevented a terrorist attack on the American embassy in Honduras that would have killed 200 people. In 1987, operations I supported disrupted a Soviet weapons shipment that was intended for groups planning attacks on American civilians. In 1992, information I provided helped prevent an assassination attempt on the American ambassador to El Salvador. She paused, letting the weight of those prevented tragedies settle over the committee room. I cannot tell you if every decision was perfect, if every operation was necessary, if every secret was worth keeping. But I can tell you that the work we did saved American lives. Whether that justifies the cost is a judgment for others to make. The hearing concluded with statements from committee members thanking Elena for her service and her willingness to provide testimony about such sensitive matters. But the most meaningful moment came after the formal session ended, when a young woman approached Elena in the hallway. It's Rodriguez. The woman said, I'm Maria Santos. I work for the committee staff, but I wanted to speak to you personally. Elena looked at the young woman, noting the intelligence and determination in her eyes. My grandmother was Isabella Martinez, Maria continued. Lived in El Salvador in the 1980s. She always said that American agents saved her village from a terrorist attack, but no one ever believed her stories. Elena felt a chill of recognition. She remembered Isabella Martinez, a brave woman who had provided crucial intelligence about planned attacks, risking her life to help American agents prevent civilian casualties. Your grandmother was a hero, Elena said quietly. Her information saved many lives. I'm sorry she never received the recognition she deserved. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She died believing that no one would ever know what she did. But hearing your testimony today, now I know she was part of something important." Elena reached out and took Maria's hand. "Your grandmother's courage made my missions possible. She represents the best of what happens when people choose to stand up for what's right, even when no one will ever know." As Elena left the Capitol building that evening, she realized that her testimony had accomplished more than just historical documentation. It had connected past and present, honored unacknowledged sacrifices, and reminded everyone that history is made by people who choose service over safety, duty over comfort, truth over convenience. That night, Elena called her sister for the first time in 30 years. "Carmen," Elena said when the phone was answered, "this is Isabella. I'm alive. And I have a lot to explain." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and involved tears, anger, joy, and the slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been severed by the requirements of national security. Carmen had aged. Their parents had died. Children had been born and grown up without knowing their Aunt Isabella had survived. But families, like countries, have the capacity to heal from necessary wounds and to welcome home those who have served in silence. 1 month later, Elena Vasquez officially became Isabella Rodriguez again, reclaiming the identity she had been forced to abandon 3 decades earlier. She moved back to her family's neighborhood, reconnected with old friends, and began the process of living openly for the first time since 1994. But she also maintained contact with the people who had been part of her journey back to recognition. Officer Williams from Miami Airport sent regular updates about improved training for TSA agents on dignity and respect. Agent Hayes kept her informed about the continuing work of intelligence services to protect American interests abroad. And Maria Santos, the young woman whose grandmother had been part of Elena's missions, came to visit every few months, bringing stories about how the declassified testimony was helping historians understand a crucial period in American foreign policy. Elena's story became a reminder that heroes often hide in plain sight, that service sometimes requires invisibility, and that the greatest sacrifices are often made by people whose names never appear in headlines. But it also demonstrated that truth has its own timeline, that secrets can eventually be told, and that dignity once recognized can never be taken away. 6 months after her testimony, Elena received an unexpected visitor. TSA Supervisor Derek Morrison stood on her front porch in Coral Gables, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small gift bag. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said nervously, "I hope you remember me. I'm the TSA agent who searched your belongings at the airport." Elena invited him in, curious about what had brought him to her door. "I wanted to apologize properly," Morrison said, sitting uncomfortably on her living room sofa. "And I wanted you to know that your words changed how I approach my job." He handed her the gift bag. Inside was a small framed photograph of the Miami Airport security checkpoint, signed by all the TSA agents who worked there. "We've instituted new training protocols based on what you taught us about dignity and respect," Morrison explained. "Every new agent receives instruction about treating passengers as individuals rather than making assumptions based on appearance or behavior." Elena examined the photograph, noting the faces of the security officers who had signed it. "And how has this changed your work experience, Officer Morrison?" Morrison thought about the question. "It's made me realize that every passenger has a story I don't know. Some might be traveling to funerals, some to celebrations, some to medical appointments, some to testify before Congress about classified operations." He smiled slightly. "I've learned to secure safety without sacrificing humanity." Elena nodded approvingly. "That's the most important lesson anyone in authority can learn." As Morrison prepared to leave, he turned back to Elena. "Can I ask you something? Why didn't you just tell us who you were at the airport? Why did you let us search your belongings when you could have stopped it with a phone call?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Because, Officer Morrison, the moment I claimed special treatment based on my background would have been the moment I became someone who believes authority comes from position rather than character. I let you do your job because your job is important, even when it's inconvenient for me." Morrison nodded, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "You were teaching us even when we didn't know we were being taught." "The best lessons often happen that way," Elena replied. After Morrison left, Elena sat in her garden thinking about the journey that had brought her from classified operations to protected anonymity to public recognition. Each phase had required different kinds of courage, different types of sacrifice, different forms of service. But the thread that connected them all was dignity, the belief that every person deserves respect, that every story matters, that every life has value beyond what's immediately visible. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a photo of a young TSA agent helping an elderly passenger navigate the security checkpoint with patience and kindness. The message read, "The lesson continues. Thank you for showing us the way." Elena smiled and typed back, "Dignity is not a lesson to be learned once. It's a choice to be made every day." As the sun set over Coral Gables, Elena reflected on the strange path that had led her from secret agent to airport passenger to congressional witness to teacher of humanity. She had served her country in ways that required invisibility, and she had served her community in ways that demanded visibility. Both forms of service had value. Both had required courage. Both had contributed to a better world. But perhaps the most important service she had provided was the simplest, reminding people in positions of authority that their power came with the responsibility to treat others with dignity, regardless of age, accent, appearance, or apparent importance. Elena Rodriguez had spent 30 years hiding from history. She was helping to write it, one lesson in human dignity at a time. The story of Elena Vasquez had ended. The legacy of Isabella Rodriguez was just beginning.